On a frozen February morning in 1900, Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh stood in the cellar of the Holbrook Inn, staring at what would haunt him for the rest of his life. Scattered across the dirt floor were fragments of human bones, some still bearing knife marks. In the corner, a large iron pot sat cold and empty, its interior stained with residue that the sheriff could not bring himself to examine too closely. Above him, the inn stood silent and abandoned. The Holbrooks were gone. But the 12 travelers who had checked in during the brutal winter months were gone too, and only one had lived to tell what he had seen in that kitchen. Welcome to this journey into one of Iowa's most disturbing and suppressed mysteries. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you brave enough to listen to this alone in the dark, or do you need company for what's coming? Let me know. Your community keeps these forgotten stories alive. This is the story of the Holbrook Inn, a modest establishment on the desolate road between Cedar Rapids and Des Moines. In the winter of 1899, this inn became known for two things: its warm hospitality and its thick, savory stew that travelers praised in letters home, letters that in many cases would be the last their families ever received. The case file remains incomplete. What we know comes from fragments: the sheriff's personal journal, discovered in 1967, testimonies from neighboring farmers, medical examiner reports that were quickly sealed, and the frantic, barely coherent statement given by Thomas Wicker, the man who escaped the inn on January 28, 1900, stumbling through 3 miles of snow to reach the nearest town. Ember Hollow, Iowa, was not a destination. It was a waypoint, a cluster of buildings along a rural route that saw frequent traffic during harvest season and became nearly impassable in winter. The Holbrook Inn sat at the edge of town, a 2-story structure with a red door and shuttered windows. Silas and Edith Holbrook had operated it since 1894, catering primarily to merchants, cattle traders, and the occasional family relocating west. By all accounts, the Holbrooks were unremarkable. Silas was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, who kept the property in good repair. Edith was known for her cooking, particularly her stew, a dish she served every evening to guests, always from the same heavy black pot. Travelers mentioned it in their correspondence. "Best meal I've had on the road," wrote a merchant named Harold Finch in October 1899. "The inn may be humble, but Mrs. Holbrook's cooking is worth the stop." Harold Finch never made it home. Neither did his traveling companion, a man named Douglas Pruitt. Their wagon was found abandoned 2 miles past the inn, its contents untouched. At the time, it was assumed they had fallen victim to the elements. Winter had come early that year, and the roads were treacherous. But Harold and Douglas were only the first. Between October 1899 and February 1900, 12 people disappeared after staying at the Holbrook Inn. 12. The pattern went unnoticed at first. Iowa was a large state, and missing travelers were not uncommon. Robberies, accidents, illness, all took their toll. But by late January, families began comparing notes. Letters had stopped. Telegrams went unanswered, and every missing person had one thing in common. They had all stopped at Ember Hollow. When Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh received the 3rd inquiry in as many weeks, he decided to pay the inn a visit. What he found there would force the state to bury the case for decades. But before we uncover what the sheriff discovered, we need to understand the world that allowed the Holbrook Inn to operate in the shadows for so long. A world of isolation, desperation, and the brutal winter of 1899. Because what happened at the Holbrook Inn did not begin with murder. It began with hunger. Iowa, in the late 1890s, was a state caught between progress and poverty. The railroad had connected major cities, but vast stretches of rural land remained isolated, particularly in winter. Small towns like Ember Hollow existed on the margins, their population swelling in summer and dwindling to a handful of residents when snow blocked the roads. The winter of 1899 was exceptionally harsh. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks. Snowstorms swept through the plains with little warning. Farmers who had barely survived the economic panic of 1893 now faced another crisis: failed crops, frozen livestock, and supply lines that could not reach them. Starvation was not uncommon. Desperation bred strange decisions. Ember Hollow had never been prosperous. Founded in 1878 as a rest stop for freight wagons, it consisted of a general store, a blacksmith, a church that held services once a month, and the Holbrook Inn. By 1899, the population had dwindled to fewer than 30 permanent residents. Most were farmers who worked land that barely produced enough to survive. Silas Holbrook had arrived in Ember Hollow in 1894 with his wife, Edith, purchasing the inn from a widow who could no longer maintain it. Little is known about the Holbrooks' lives before Iowa. Census records list Silas as having been born in Pennsylvania in 1852 and Edith in Ohio in 1855. They had no children. When asked about their past, they offered vague answers. Silas had worked in lumber. Edith had been a schoolteacher. Neither had family ties to Iowa. What drew them to Ember Hollow remains unclear. In his testimony after the discoveries, a local farmer named Amos Rutledge recalled a conversation with Silas in the summer of 1895. I asked him why he'd settle in a place like this, where there's nothing but hard ground and harder winters. He said he liked the quiet, said he and Edith wanted a simple life, away from cities and crowds. I thought it was odd at the time. Most people want to leave places like Ember Hollow, not move to them. The Holbrooks kept to themselves. They attended church sporadically. Edith occasionally purchased supplies from the general store, but she grew much of her own food in a small garden behind the inn. Silas maintained the property with meticulous care, repairing the roof, chopping wood, and ensuring the cellar stayed dry. To the few residents of Ember Hollow, they were simply another quiet couple trying to make a living. The inn itself was modest. It had 6 guest rooms on the second floor, each sparsely furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a small window. The ground floor consisted of a common room with a fireplace, a dining area, and a kitchen where Edith prepared meals. Travelers paid 50 cents a night for lodging and 25 cents for supper. The price was fair, and the Holbrooks had no trouble attracting guests during the warmer months. But winter changed things. The road through Ember Hollow became nearly impassable, and travelers were few. Those who did pass through were often desperate, caught in storms, running low on supplies, or simply unprepared for the brutal conditions. The Holbrook Inn became a refuge of last resort. It was during these months that Edith's cooking gained its reputation. Her stew, in particular, was mentioned repeatedly in letters and diaries. A cattle trader named Samuel Dwyer wrote to his wife in November 1899, "Stayed at a small inn outside Ember Hollow. The woman who runs it makes a stew unlike anything I've tasted. Rich, thick, with a flavor I can't quite place. She wouldn't share the recipe, said it was a family secret." Samuel Dwyer vanished 2 days later. The economic hardships of the late 1890s cannot be overstated. Many rural families survived on little more than cornmeal and potatoes. Meat was a luxury. Game was scarce. The winter of 1899 made everything worse. Supply wagons couldn't get through. Livestock froze. Desperate people made desperate choices. There were whispers, even then, not about the Holbrooks specifically, but about survival in general. Stories circulated of trappers in the far north who had resorted to unspeakable acts to survive harsh winters. Newspapers carried sensationalized accounts of the Donner Party decades after the fact. The line between civilization and savagery, some said, was thinner than people wanted to believe, especially when hunger set in. Ember Hollow had its own small tragedies. In December 1899, a farmer's child died of pneumonia. In January, an elderly woman froze to death in her home after running out of firewood. These deaths were recorded, mourned, and accepted as the cost of surviving in such a harsh place. Other disappearances, however, went unrecorded. By early 1900, the Holbrook Inn had served as a waypoint for dozens of travelers. Most passed through without incident, but 12 did not, and when the truth began to surface, the question that haunted investigators was not just what had happened, but how long it had been happening, and whether anyone had suspected sooner. Because the Holbrooks were not the first to run an inn in Ember Hollow. The widow who had sold them the property, a woman named Margaret Kane, had died under mysterious circumstances in 1896, found in her home with no clear cause of death. Her inn had also been known for its meals, and during her tenure, at least 3 travelers had vanished without a trace. The connection would not be made until much later. For now, in January 1900, Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh was only beginning to suspect that something was terribly wrong. Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh was not a man prone to superstition. At 42 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades enforcing the law in rural Iowa, dealing with cattle thieves, land disputes, and the occasional drunken brawl. He believed in evidence, procedure, and the basic decency of most people. But in late January 1900, that belief began to crack. The inquiries had started slowly. In mid-December, a woman named Clara Finch arrived at his office in Cedar Rapids, asking about her husband, Harold. He had left for Des Moines 6 weeks prior and had not returned. His last letter, posted from a small town called Ember Hollow, had arrived in early November. Clara had waited, assuming delays caused by winter storms, but by December she could wait no longer. Marsh assured her he would investigate, though privately he suspected Harold had either met with an accident or decided not to return home. Such cases, while tragic, were not uncommon. Then came the second inquiry. A merchant named Edward Lawn had sent his son, Benjamin, to deliver goods to a buyer in Des Moines. Benjamin, 23 years old, had last been seen in mid-November. His route would have taken him through Ember Hollow. No letters, no telegrams, no word. The third inquiry came on January 18th, 1900. This time, it was a desperate mother, asking about her daughter and son-in-law who'd been traveling to start a new life in Nebraska. They had passed through Cedar Rapids in early December, mentioning they would stop at a small inn along the way. Ember Hollow, 3 missing persons, 3 families, 1 connection. Marsh pulled records from the county office, cross-referencing missing person reports with travel routes and dates. What he found disturbed him. Over the past 4 months, at least 8 people had disappeared along the road between Cedar Rapids and Des Moines. All had been traveling during winter. All had likely stopped at Ember Hollow. There was nowhere else to stop on that desolate stretch. On January 22nd, 1900, Marsh rode out to Ember Hollow alone. He did not alert the Holbrooks. He did not bring a deputy. He wanted to observe quietly, ask a few questions, and determine whether there was any legitimate cause for concern or whether he was chasing shadows. He arrived at dusk. The inn looked ordinary. Smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight glowing in the windows, fresh snow covering the yard. Silas Holbrook answered the door, greeting Marsh with polite suspicion. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" Marsh explained that he was following up on some missing person reports and wondered if the Holbrooks had seen any of the individuals in question. He provided names and descriptions. Silas listened carefully, then shook his head. "Can't say I recall anyone matching those descriptions. We don't get many travelers this time of year. Too dangerous." Marsh asked to see the guest registry. Silas hesitated, then retrieved a leather-bound book from behind the front desk. Marsh flipped through the pages. The entries were sparse. Most recent was from early January, a man named Peter Calloway, who had stayed one night and continued west. Before that, only a handful of names dating back to November. None of the missing persons were listed. "You're certain none of these people stayed here?" Marsh asked. "Certain," Silas replied. "If they had, they'd be in the book." Marsh thanked him and prepared to leave, but as he turned toward the door, Edith appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She smiled warmly. "Sheriff, you've come all this way. At least let me offer you supper before you ride back. I've just finished a stew." Marsh was hungry. The ride had been long and cold. He accepted. The dining room was small but clean. Edith served him a bowl of thick, dark stew, along with bread and coffee. Marsh ate slowly, trying to place the flavor. It was rich, almost too rich, with an aftertaste he couldn't identify. Meat, certainly, but unlike any venison or pork he'd tasted before. "This is excellent, Mrs. Holbrook. What's in it?" Edith smiled. "A family recipe, secret ingredients." Marsh finished the meal, thanked the Holbrooks, and left. As he rode back toward Cedar Rapids, something nagged at him. The registry had been too clean. The Holbrooks had been too polite. And that stew. Why couldn't he stop thinking about that stew? 2 days later, Thomas Wicker appeared. Wicker stumbled into Cedar Rapids on the morning of January 28th, frostbitten and delirious. He collapsed outside the general store, muttering incoherently. When a doctor examined him, they found him severely malnourished and suffering from exposure. But more disturbing were his injuries, deep lacerations on his wrists as though he had been bound, and burn marks on his hands. When Wicker regained consciousness, he told Marsh a story that defied belief. Wicker, a 32-year-old surveyor, had stopped at the Holbrook Inn on January 25th, seeking shelter from a snowstorm. Silas had welcomed him. Edith had served him stew. But that night, unable to sleep, Wicker had heard sounds from below, scraping, dragging, something heavy being moved. Curious, he had crept downstairs and found the cellar door ajar. What he saw inside made him flee in terror. He claimed he saw Silas butchering something or someone on a large wooden table. He saw Edith stirring that black pot. He saw bones. Wicker tried to run, but Silas caught him, tied him up, and locked him in a storage room. For 2 days he was held captive. He could hear voices, the sound of knives, the bubbling of that pot. On the 3rd night, he managed to free himself, breaking a window and running into the snow. Marsh listened to Wicker's story with growing dread. It sounded insane, but the man's injuries were real, and the missing persons were real. On January 30th, 1900, Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh returned to Ember Hollow with 4 deputies and a warrant. They were prepared for resistance. What they found was worse. The inn was empty. The Holbrooks were gone. Pause here and tell us in the comments. What do you think Sheriff Marsh found inside that cellar? What do you believe the Holbrooks were hiding? Share your theories and let's uncover this nightmare together. The cellar of the Holbrook Inn was accessed through a heavy wooden door behind the kitchen. It had no windows, only a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Sheriff Marsh carried a lantern as he led the deputies down, the smell hitting them before they reached the bottom. A thick, putrid odor of decay mixed with something else, something burnt and acrid. The cellar was larger than expected, extending beneath the entire ground floor of the inn. The dirt floor was uneven, and in several places it appeared to have been recently disturbed. Against the far wall stood a long wooden table, stained dark with what could only be blood. On the table lay a large cleaver, a boning knife, and several other tools that belonged in a butcher's shop. Near the table sat the black iron pot Edith had used for her stews. Even cold residue clung to its interior, bits of meat, congealed fat, and something that looked disturbingly like bone fragments. But it was the corner of the cellar that made one deputy vomit. Piled loosely in a shallow pit were bones, human bones, femurs, ribs, sections of spine, some still bearing knife marks where flesh had been carved away. A medical examiner would later confirm that the bones belonged to at least 4 different individuals, though a precise count was impossible due to the condition of the remains. Marsh ordered his men to search the rest of the property. In the storage shed behind the inn, they found personal belongings, suitcases, wallets, jewelry, clothing, items that had belonged to travelers, items that should have left with their owners. Among the belongings was a leather satchel containing letters addressed to Harold Finch. Another case held a woman's coat embroidered with the initials MT, later identified as belonging to Mary Thornton, a 26-year-old woman who had vanished in December while traveling with her husband James. James's pocket watch was also found. In the kitchen, deputies discovered Edith's recipe book, a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes. Most entries were ordinary, instructions for bread, preserves, pies. But interspersed throughout were other entries, written in a tighter, more frantic hand. One entry, dated November 12, 1899, read, "Provisions low, winter stores insufficient. S suggests we make use of what Providence provides. God forgive us." Another, from December 3rd, "The Thorntons, young, well-fed, enough to last through January if carefully rationed. S says waste nothing." A third entry, undated, "The meat must be prepared properly. Boil first to remove the taste. Add rosemary, thyme, potatoes. No one has questioned it. They asked for seconds." The implications were undeniable. The stew that travelers had praised, the stew that had earned Edith Holbrook a reputation for fine cooking, had been made from human flesh. But the most chilling discovery came from Edith's personal diary, found hidden beneath a floorboard in the couple's bedroom. The entries spanned 5 years, beginning in 1895, shortly after the Holbrooks had purchased the inn. The diary revealed a descent into horror that had been gradual, almost methodical. The earliest entries were mundane: observations about the inn, complaints about the isolation, notes about guests. But by late 1896, the tone shifted. December 1896. "Winter has been brutal. We have nothing left. No money for supplies, no travelers to provide income. S killed the last chicken today. We ate it in silence. I do not know how we will survive until spring." January 1897. "A man stopped at the inn last night. A drifter, no family, no destination. He paid for a room but had no money for food. S told him to leave in the morning, but the man did not leave. S said it was an accident. I do not believe him." The entry ended there, but the next one, dated a week later, was colder. January 1897. "We buried him in the woods. No one will find him. No one will ask. S says we had no choice. Perhaps he is right." The diary did not mention the drifter again, but by the winter of 1898, the entries became more explicit. November 1898. "Another traveler, a merchant, alone. S says we cannot afford to be weak. He says survival demands sacrifices. I helped him. God help me, I helped him." December 1898. "The meat lasted 3 weeks. We stored it in the cellar. S built a cold box to keep it fresh. I cook it slowly, in stews and roasts. It is no different from venison, I tell myself. It is only meat." By 1899, Edith's entries had lost all pretense of guilt. They had become practical, almost clinical. October 1899, 2 travelers tonight. Finch and Pruitt, both well-fed. Healthy. S says we must act soon. Winter will be harsh again. I am preparing the pot. November 1899. The Thorntons. A young couple. She cried. I could hear her through the floor. S says I must not think of them as people. He says they are provisions. He says we are doing what animals do, surviving. January 1900. The surveyor saw. He ran. S caught him, but he is strong. We must leave. We cannot stay. I do not know where we will go, but we cannot stay. The final entry was dated January 28, 1900, the same night Thomas Wicker escaped. We are leaving tonight. The law will come. They will find everything. I do not care anymore. I'm so tired. S says we will go west, change our names, start over. But I know the truth. We are damned. The diary ended there. Sheriff Marsh immediately issued warrants for the arrest of Silas and Edith Holbrook on charges of murder. Descriptions were circulated to law enforcement agencies across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. Rewards were posted, but the Holbrooks had vanished. The case attracted national attention. Newspapers across the country ran sensational headlines. Cannibal innkeepers of Iowa, the House of Human Stew, the Holbrook Horror. Journalists descended on Ember Hollow, interviewing residents, photographing the inn, and publishing lurid accounts that mixed fact with speculation. The medical examiner's report, filed in February 1900, confirmed that the bones found in the cellar belonged to at least 4 individuals, 2 men, 1 woman, and 1 person of undetermined sex. The condition of the bones suggested they had been boiled and then partially burned, likely in an attempt to destroy evidence. Forensic analysis of the tools found in the cellar revealed traces of human blood. The black iron pot, when examined under magnification, contained residue that included human tissue. But the most damning evidence came from the chemical analysis of the stew itself. A small sample, still congealed in the pot, was sent to a laboratory in Chicago. The results, delivered in March 1900, confirmed the presence of human proteins, specifically myoglobin and collagen consistent with skeletal muscle tissue. Edith Holbrook had been serving human flesh to her guests. The investigation expanded to include Margaret Kane, the widow who had owned the inn before the Holbrooks. Exhumation of her body revealed signs of arsenic poisoning, leading investigators to theorize that Silas and Edith had murdered her to acquire the property. Whether they had been cannibals before arriving in Iowa, or whether desperation had driven them to it, remained unclear. Interviews with former guests, those who had survived their stays at the Holbrook Inn, yielded disturbing testimonies. Several recalled the stew, its unusual richness, its unforgettable taste. One man admitted he had returned to the inn specifically because of Edith's cooking, calling it the best meal I'd ever eaten. When told what he had likely consumed, the man became violently ill. Thomas Wicker, the sole escapee, provided additional details under questioning. He described hearing Silas and Edith argue in the cellar, Edith expressing reluctance, Silas insisting they had no choice. He described the sound of the cleaver striking bone, the smell of meat cooking, the casual way Edith had hummed while stirring the pot. I thought I was dreaming, Wicker said during his testimony. I thought it couldn't be real. But when I saw the table, when I saw what was on it, I knew what they were, and I knew if I didn't run, I'd be next. Wicker never fully recovered from his ordeal. He moved to California in 1902 and refused to speak publicly about the case again. The Holbrook Inn was burned to the ground in March 1900 by order of the county. Residents of Ember Hollow, horrified by the attention and the stigma, began abandoning the town. By 1905, Ember Hollow had fewer than 10 residents. By 1920, it was a ghost town. But the Holbrooks themselves were never found. Despite widespread searches, multiple reported sightings, and ongoing investigations, Silas and Edith Holbrook disappeared without a trace. Some believed they had fled to Canada. Others speculated they had assumed new identities and continued west. A few dark theories suggested they had died during their escape, their bodies lost to the wilderness. But one question haunted every investigator. If they had survived, had they stopped? Or were they somewhere else running another inn, serving another stew? The case of the Holbrook Inn did not end with the burning of the building or the disappearance of its owners. For decades, fragments of the story continued to surface. New evidence, new testimonies, and new horrors that suggested the full scope of what had happened in Ember Hollow might never be fully known. In 1923, a farmer ploughing a field 3 miles east of the former inn site unearthed a shallow grave containing the remains of 2 individuals. Forensic examination determined they had been buried sometime between 1897 and 1899. Both had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. Neither was ever identified, but investigators believed they were early victims of the Holbrooks, travelers who had disappeared before the systematic killings of 1899. In 1934, a woman named Agnes Holbrook was arrested in Oregon for theft. During questioning, she claimed to be the niece of Silas Holbrook and admitted that her uncle and aunt had lived under assumed names in Montana. Between 1900 and 1910, she described them as haunted, always looking over their shoulders, never staying in one place long. According to Agnes, Edith had died of pneumonia in 1911, and Silas had disappeared shortly after. Agnes could not, or would not, provide proof of her claims, and investigators were never able to verify her story. She was released after serving a short sentence and vanished from public record. In 1947, a historian researching small-town Iowa came across references to the Holbrook case in county archives. Intrigued, he began compiling a comprehensive account of the murders, interviewing descendants of Ember Hollow residents and reviewing old newspaper clippings. His research led him to a startling discovery. Between 1895 and 1900, at least 23 travelers had disappeared along the route through Ember Hollow, far more than the 12 officially attributed to the Holbrooks. The historian Dr. Raymond Coulter theorized that the Holbrooks had not acted alone. He pointed to the logistics of disposing of so many bodies, the maintenance of the inn, and the need to avoid suspicion. Coulter believed that other residents of Ember Hollow, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of complicity, had been aware of what was happening and had either participated or remained silent. Coulter's theory was met with skepticism. Most historians dismissed it as sensationalism, but Coulter uncovered one piece of evidence that was harder to ignore: a journal belonging to Amos Rutledge, the farmer who had lived near the inn. Rutledge's journal, dated 1899, included this entry: "Saw Silas Holbrook dragging something heavy into the woods tonight. Looked like a body wrapped in canvas. Told myself it was a deer. Told myself not to ask questions. God forgive me, I did nothing." Rutledge had lived with the knowledge of the Holbrooks' crimes and had never come forward. He died in 1920, taking his guilt to the grave. In 1958, a construction crew working on a highway expansion near the former site of Ember Hollow uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 6 individuals. The bones were fragmented and showed signs of having been deliberately broken and burned. Carbon dating placed them in the late 1890s. Forensic anthropologists concluded that the victims had been dismembered post-mortem, consistent with the methods used by the Holbrooks. The discovery reignited interest in the case. Newspapers ran retrospectives. True crime writers published books. Descendants of the victims demanded answers, but by then, anyone who might have had first-hand knowledge of the events was long dead. In 1967, Sheriff Nathaniel Marsh's grandson donated his grandfather's personal effects to the Iowa State Historical Society. Among the items was Marsh's journal, which contained detailed notes about the Holbrook investigation. One entry dated April 1900 stood out. Received a letter today, no return address, postmarked from Colorado. Inside was a single sentence. We did what we had to do to survive. Judge us if you must, but know that hunger makes monsters of us all. I believe it was from Edith Holbrook. I cannot prove it. I burned the letter. If Marsh had indeed received a letter from Edith, it would confirm that she and Silas had survived their escape. But without the letter itself, the claim remained unverifiable. In 1981, an elderly woman in a nursing home in Wyoming told staff members that her parents had once run an inn in Iowa and had been forced to flee after something terrible happened. She refused to elaborate, and when pressed, became agitated and withdrawn. Attempts to verify her identity revealed that her records had been falsified. Her birth certificate listed parents who had never existed. She died 3 weeks later, taking her secrets with her. Was she the daughter of Silas and Edith Holbrook? The timeline suggested it was possible, but without concrete evidence, the connection remained speculative. The most recent development came in 2003, when a metal detector enthusiast, exploring the site of the former Holbrook Inn, discovered a buried lockbox. Inside were several items: a silver locket, a wedding ring engraved with the initials E.H., and a folded piece of paper. The paper, brittle and yellowed, contained a single line written in faded ink: "Forgive me." The handwriting matched samples from Edith Holbrook's diary. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Edith returned to Ember Hollow at some point after fleeing? Had she buried the box as an act of penance, or had someone else placed it there on her behalf? The box was donated to the Iowa State Historical Society, where it remains part of the Holbrook collection. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Silas and Edith Holbrook were never captured, never tried, never held accountable for their crimes. The exact number of their victims remains unknown. The question of whether they acted out of desperation or calculation remains unanswered. But the horror of what they did, the violation of the most fundamental human taboo, continues to haunt the memory of Ember Hollow. So what really happened at the Holbrook Inn? After all the evidence, all the testimonies, all the years of investigation, the truth remains elusive. But several theories have emerged, each offering a different explanation for one of the darkest chapters in Iowa history. Theory 1. Survival cannibalism gone wrong. The most sympathetic theory suggests that the Holbrooks were driven to cannibalism by desperation. The brutal winter of 1899, combined with economic hardship, left them with no viable means of survival. Their first act, perhaps the killing of the drifter in 1897, was unplanned, a crime of opportunity born from starvation. But once the line was crossed, it became easier to cross again and again. Over time, what had begun as survival became routine, then habitual. By 1899, the Holbrooks were no longer killing to survive. They were killing because it had become their way of life. Theory 2. Premeditated serial murder. The second theory is far darker. It suggests that Silas and Edith Holbrook were not victims of circumstance, but calculating killers who saw an opportunity and exploited it. The purchase of an isolated inn, the deliberate targeting of travelers with no family ties, the careful disposal of evidence, all point to a level of planning inconsistent with desperate survival. Some investigators believe the Holbrooks may have committed similar crimes before arriving in Iowa, and that Ember Hollow was simply their most successful hunting ground. This theory is supported by the sheer number of victims and the efficiency with which they were killed and processed. Theory 3. A folie à deux. The third theory focuses on the psychological dynamic between Silas and Edith. Folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, occurs when delusions are transmitted from one individual to another. Some psychologists who have studied the case believe that one of the Holbrooks, likely Silas, was a psychopath who manipulated the other into participating. Edith's diary entries show reluctance, guilt, and gradual desensitization. She may have been coerced, either through fear or through psychological conditioning, into becoming complicit. Alternatively, some suggest that Edith was the primary instigator and Silas the reluctant participant, a reversal that challenges assumptions about gender and violence. Theory 4. The community knew. The most controversial theory is that the residents of Ember Hollow were aware, at least partially, of what was happening at the inn. The logistics of killing, butchering, and disposing of 12 or more people over the course of several months would have required space, time, and a lack of interference. Amos Rutledge's journal entry suggests that at least one person saw something suspicious and chose not to report it. Others may have suspected, but in a community struggling to survive, turning a blind eye may have seemed preferable to confronting a nightmare. This theory paints a picture of collective guilt, where an entire town became complicit through inaction. Which theory is correct? Perhaps none of them. Perhaps all of them. The truth may lie somewhere in the intersection of desperation, madness, and moral collapse. What we know for certain is this. Between 1899 and 1900, at least 12 people disappeared after staying at the Holbrook Inn. Human remains were found in the cellar. Human tissue was identified in the stew, and 2 people, Silas and Edith Holbrook, fled into the wilderness and were never seen again. The Holbrook Inn is gone now, burned and buried beneath a century of growth. Ember Hollow is a ghost town, its buildings collapsed, its streets reclaimed by nature, but the memory remains, and sometimes on cold winter nights, when the wind howls across the Iowa plains, people swear they can still smell something cooking, something rich, something savory, something that should not be named. To this day, no one knows the truth about what happened in that cellar. No one knows how many victims there really were. And no one knows where Silas and Edith Holbrook went after they fled, or whether they ever stopped. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened? Do you believe the Holbrooks were driven by desperation, or were they something far worse? Do you think they survived, or did they die in the wilderness? Leave your theories in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell to join our haunted community. We uncover the darkest stories history tried to bury, and your engagement keeps these forgotten horrors from fading into silence. Until next time, remember, some hungers can never be satisfied, some secrets can never be buried, and some places, no matter how much time passes, never stop whispering. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and whatever you do, never trust a stew.